Up next, the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show with Snowden Bishop. After this message.
Evergreen's calling.
Now that doctors and patients have discovered the many benefits of hemp-derived CBD, Alpine Miracle's nano-emulsion CBD formula is one of the most bioavailable on the market today. It's 100% THC-free, so you can order it online anywhere in the U.S. Order yours today at alpinemiracle.com. Scientists are just beginning to understand its essential role in maintaining optimal health. Get yours today. Use the code REPORTER and receive 10% off. Don't wait. Get it now at alpinemiracle.com. And now, it's time for the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show with Snowden Bishop. Listen in as Snowden interviews cannabis industry pioneers, marijuana experts, policymakers, medical practitioners, patients, and other amazing individuals with compelling stories to share. It all happens right now. Here's the Cannabis Reporter, Snowden Bishop.
Hi, and welcome back to the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show. I'm your host, Snowden Bishop, and I'm delighted you could join us today. This week marks our second anniversary of broadcasting our show on the radio. It's remarkable to consider how far we've come since we finally were able to convince a single local talk radio station in Phoenix to air a show about cannabis at all. Today, we are thrilled to be airing on roughly 400 stations across the nation and grateful to have this public forum to raise awareness about one of the most important plant substances on Earth. In the last couple of years, we've begun to see mainstream media normalizing the conversation about cannabis, and public acceptance has reached an all-time high. We've finally seen Congress warm up to industrial hemp in the last few days, but the DOJ still refuses to reschedule marijuana, so that means we have a lot more work to do before we see any comprehensive marijuana policy change at the federal level. Despite the amazing medical discoveries, positive impact of regulation, and scientific proof that it's necessary for human health, there are still too many whose perceptions remain clouded by decades of reefer madness propaganda. Just today, a colleague mentioned that a local doctor told her teenage niece that the hemp oil she was taking would cause schizophrenia. I mean, that's astonishing, especially when you consider that myth was busted decades ago. But honestly, it wouldn't be fair to blame the doctor. Federal prohibition has barred federally funded academic institutions from researching cannabis in the United States, and only a handful of medical schools even mention the endocannabinoid system. It is, however, a stark reminder that there's a lot more work to do before the virtues of cannabis reach the critical mass of common knowledge. Fortunately, there's a growing number of accomplished researchers, scientists, and medical professionals who are transcending the stigma and devoting countless hours to education and advocacy. That's the topic, and I am very excited to introduce you to our guest. Josh Crossney, he's the president and founder of CSC Events and JCanna, which is a Maryland-based 501c3 nonprofit organization devoted to the advancement of cannabis science, analytic testing, and personalized precision medicine. He has parlayed his background in analytical science, recruiting, and event planning into industry-wide efforts to bridge the gap between analytical sciences and the business of medical cannabis. The Cannabis Science Conference gives him the platform to advocate for improved quality of medicinal cannabis products and engage industry stakeholders in addressing the lack of unified methods and standards for testing cannabis for potency and purity. Especially passionate about helping pediatric patients suffering from debilitating illness, Josh is a contributing author for multiple publications, including The Analytical Science, Medical Jane, and 1000 Watts magazines. He's also done on-camera hosting and moderating for multiple cannabis and scientific media outlets, and was recently featured in Marijuana Ventures 40 Under 40 Rising Stars in the Cannabis Industry issue, recognized 2 years in a row at the Cannabis Business Awards as 2016 and 2017 MVP of the Year, and he was featured in a cover story for 1000 Watts magazine 2017 420 issue. Josh, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me today. It's really a pleasure to join you.
I am excited to start talking to you about the scientific event that you have coming up this year. Tell me a little bit about what inspired you to get involved with the event.
So that's a great question. It was something that I personally have been interested in the cannabis industry and kind of on the sidelines. I'm based in Baltimore, Maryland. So kind of based on the sidelines, kind of watching what the West Coast was doing over the years. So I kind of started to get involved and I started attending some shows and I saw that there was really a lack of developing science. There wasn't really a whole lot of things that focuses on the quality control and the testing and extraction technologies of the industry. And as you touched on in my bio, I have a background in analytical staffing and recruiting. So this, for me, it just kind of pinged in my mind. There's this huge void, and what an important void, when you're talking about the quality of cannabis that, medical patients are using, especially when you're looking at immunocompromised patients. So I really just wanted to kind of band together and use some contacts that I had from the science industry, connect them with some of the people I started working with, more on the business side of the cannabis industry. And I'll be completely honest with you, when we first started planning our first event for CSC events, it was not really intended to be a huge convention conference type of thing. But I learned early on in this process that there was just such a need for this, and it just grew and grew. And initially in our first year in 2016, we went through 3 venues leading up to the first conference because we just kept outgrowing and plateauing in the spaces that we were at in the way of vendors as well as attendees. So we were really great that we were able to keep adapting and growing into new locations. And then we did move to the convention center after our first show in 2017. We were at a hotel venue in 2016, and after the first one, we obviously knew that we were either going to plateau there, or if we were going to continue to grow, we'd have to kind of kick it up a notch and do one of the larger centers.
So how many people attend normally?
So we're working on our third one. I'll give you the quick rundown of kind of the trajectory of since we started. So in 2016, we had about 800 attendees for our first show and about 75 vendors in the way of exhibitors and sponsors. And then our first show at the convention center, which just wrapped up the 2017 Cannabis Science Conference in August of 2017, we had about 2,400 attendees and about 125 vendors. So this year, we're really gearing up and pushing for at least 3,000 attendees, and we're looking to have about 160 plus vendors this year.
And so for people listening, this is taking place in August. I think you said the 15th and 16th. Is that correct? In Portland, Oregon?
So the conference is the 2018 Cannabis Science Conference is August 27th through 29th in Portland at the Oregon Convention Center. And on the 27th of August, pre-conference event that we do is called the Canna Boot Camp. And that's a really fun, exciting event that we do. That's a full day hands-on workshop that covers many aspects of the cannabis industry, including testing, sample preparation, extraction, cultivation, manufacturing, and so on. So this is really, like I said, a hands-on full day training workshop where participants come and they kind of go through different sections throughout the day, and they hit on each of these different topics that I mentioned, and they get real life demonstrations and get to go up and do hands-on volunteering and actually running the equipment and testing out some of these technologies that are being used for whether it be cannabis testing or cannabis extraction, or even in the cultivation side of things, or edibles manufacturing, for instance. So that has been really, really popular. It's sold out in 2016 and 2017, and we're a little over halfway to being sold out this year. So we definitely encourage people, if that's something they're interested in, to get those early, because come early July, mid-July, those will definitely be gone.
Yeah, it's. I'm sure that it will be, and there seems to be such a need for this sort of thing, and especially educating people about the importance of the science of cannabis. So, I mean, so many people have different perceptions about what cannabis is, what it does to your body. Some people are more interested in the fun that they feel they can have with it, as opposed to the medical benefits and stuff like that. But I think that there really is, throughout the medical community, the scientific community, and the educational community as well, there's such a gap between what information is really readily available and what needs to be learned about the cannabis plant. And I mean, in your experience, you've probably met a lot of people in that space who are out there advocating for more education and more medical training. And what are some of the most specific aspects that you feel need to be covered as you move into this next conference?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's like exactly like what I was saying before about, filling these voids and bridging these gaps. And that's exactly why we kind of wanted to come in and do what we're doing with this. And, I really feel like some of the biggest gaps that need to be bridged are obviously physician education. There's a lack of that right now. Doctors are not being classically trained about cannabis and the endocannabinoid system in their medical training. Doctors, like for instance, Dr. Uma Dhanabalan, who's a dear friend and one of our speakers year after year. She's a Harvard, trained doctor. She never learned about the endocannabinoid system, never learned about cannabis as medicine, never learned about the fact that this was used in medicine. It was in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, before the reefer madness and the stigmatization. So for people like her who are now involved in this industry, it's infuriating that they go through all this years of education. Obviously it's not, exactly cheap to go and become a doctor, and especially twice over. So really, I think that we need to see more of these universities really training and educating doctors more on this. The hard thing with the university factor is obviously cannabis is a federally illegal drug. So when you're looking at hospitals and universities and things like that, there is that huge risk of them losing their federal funding. And, obviously, some of these institutions get quite a bit of their, annual intakes from federal funding. So I think that's a big portion. I think obviously, patient education, enough can't be said for that. I think that it's very important, whether it be cannabis or, other drugs in Western medicine, when you're talking about pharmaceuticals. I think it's very important for a patient to have a relationship with their own healthcare and to know why what they're using is working for them, and how to have a conversation with their doctor or their cannabis specialist about what's going on in their life. I think obviously analytical chemist education is really important. That's one thing that we see a lot of, and we get a lot of that at our boot camp is we'll see expert analytical chemists that are genius in their trades, but and they obviously know the equipment that we're using to do cannabis testing and extraction, but they don't necessarily know the applications that it's being used with. And one of the things that can make it difficult for instance, a chemist that's getting involved with cannabis for the first time is, cannabis can be so many different consistencies. It can be, lotions, it can be tinctures, it can be, obviously flour, it can be concentrates. So this, variance in the matrices makes it sometimes difficult to know exactly what you're going to do. So obviously, you can't test all these different things exactly the same way. So it's coming up with the standard procedure for each of these different consistencies. So, I mean, for me, those are three of the biggest areas that really need the bridge of the gap of education. And one thing I think that gets left out a lot is not just the medical aspects of cannabis and the potential, benefits and health, health things. I think it's also really important for everyone to be educated on the history of cannabis, both going all the way back in time to first use and discovery, to U.S. history when, this was a medicine until the late 1930s. I think it's very important for people to do the research on the people that were involved in the propaganda of, the reefer madness is what we all call it. I think that enough can't be said about that, because I can't tell you how many times that I speak with people, even people that, you would consider part of the industry, and they don't know that whole backstory on how we kind of lost this as a medicine in the U.S.
Yeah, and another thing that I think is missing from the nomenclature throughout this country especially is the environmental impact that cannabis can have on industry. So
absolutely.
It really is one of the most abundantly available resources. If only we would grow it here. It could replace fossil fuels for everything. You mentioned so much there, and Dr. Uma, I adore her, and she is one of the biggest medical champions in terms of getting the word out, and especially in light of the opiate epidemic, and when you're dealing with athletes and people who have debilitating pain issues, being victimized by the pharmaceuticals that they're taking and becoming addicts. And she really advocates for cannabis as an exit drug to help people wean off of some of those super dangerous drugs that they're being prescribed by their doctors. And, that's why it's so astonishing when I hear stories like what I mentioned earlier about doctors not being educated enough to know that they shouldn't be telling patients that cannabis is a dangerous drug that's going to give them problems in their lives. And it's so important to keep the conversations going with all of these doctors. And I think also you're right, the gap in the standardization and educating the chemists, that's also a pretty big deal. We actually just learned about a company called Verax, which is launching an entire program. And at some point, I'd love to introduce them to you. But they're basically science-oriented from the medical community, pharmaceutical side of things, who have observed some of the deficiencies in the standardization across the board and the ability of testing that's consistent from state to state, because not every state has, like you said, not every state has those quality assurance testing requirements. And everybody wants to ensure that the medicine they're taking is consistent with what's scientifically evident for whatever conditions they're taking. So to have that kind of platform, that kind of testing that's available and available on a university level so it can be transferred across state lines through permitting is just so incredibly important. So it's exciting that you're out there educating people about that as well.
I think it's really interesting, and a lot of people kind of their jaw drops when I tell them this, but, California did not require quality control testing whatsoever until they've now brought on their recreational programs. You guys recently spoke with Tracy Ryan, who's a dear friend and colleague of mine. I'm actually on the advisory board of Canna Kids as well, so I work really closely with Tracy. But, Tracy and brands like Tracy, obviously for years and years that they've been operational before 64, obviously were doing testing and they were going above and beyond what the state required them to do. But I think it's kind of interesting when you look at that example of all of these years we've been giving it to medical patients and not really that worried about the testing and requiring it. And now all of a sudden that it's a recreational program, it is being implemented. And, it's like you said, it's on one token, there's so many different forms of cannabis. So having that exact cannabinoid profile, some people say strain. I use the word strain as well, but I think in the future, when we're looking at a medical situation and we're talking about specific conditions, I think for the future of this as like medicine, I think we'll start to refer to cannabinoid profiles more so than names of strains, because I'm sure, as you know, if you're in Colorado and you have a blue dream, and then you go to California and have a blue dream, and then you go to Massachusetts and have a blue dream, chances are they're all going to be different and slightly different and maybe even very, very, very different when it comes to the cannabinoid profiles. And, we've learned that different cannabinoid profiles help different conditions better or worse. So, and then there's obviously that token, but then on the flip side of that, it's the contamination issue. So if, we end up giving cannabis to, God forbid, a pediatric cancer patient that's going through chemo, that's going through radiation, whose, tiny little immune system is already so compromised, the last thing we want to do as an industry is make people sicker. You know what I mean? We want to use this miracle plant to, help people get better. And I always say that, cannabis itself is inherently safe and no one has ever died as a direct overdose of cannabis. But when you start to talk about contaminated cannabis, especially in immunocompromised individuals, you could have problems on your hands. When you're talking about molds and pesticides and heavy metals and solvents, and when you're looking at the elderly population or the pediatric population, most of these individuals are using some kind of concentrated tincture. And the thing with, extraction processes are, if, the cannabis is contaminated and you put it through an extraction process, you're not just extracting the cannabis to a higher potency, you're also extracting any contamination present to a higher potency, potentially.
Yeah, and that is so incredibly dangerous. And Tracy and I talked about that a little bit too. We made a reference to our friend, Dr. Sue Sisley, who's doing the PTSD study, and the challenges that she's having with the product that she's having to give to these veterans that could actually be causing harm because they're being grown by the government. They won't permit her to use any other cannabis other than what they grow at the University of Mississippi. And unfortunately, that product is really substandard quality and has fewer medical benefits than just standard cannabis grown for specific profiles that would be much more effective for the veterans that she's treating in this study. And it's really quite unnerving. You mentioned something else too, with the availability, the restrictions that we have due to the federal law. One thing that really irks me to absolutely no end is the fact that pharmaceutical companies have just been granted, let's see, I think there were 6 pharmaceutical companies that were recently granted by the Department of Justice permits to import thousands of tons of cannabis product and also coca leaves and raw opium from the poppy to import in huge volumes into the United States. And yet they still won't allow the medical community to grow domestic cannabis for testing and clinical study. It just seems like such it's a double standard in so many different ways, but these pharmaceutical companies are altering the natural plant substances to create pharmaceuticals that won't be on the Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 of the Controlled Substances Act by taking, just an organic substance and adding a synthetic element to it or adulterating it to the point where the chemical profile is not the same as what is listed in the scheduling. So this is something that I think needs to be broadcast to get people aware of this so that as these laws are being passed, people understand the importance of legalization, not just to make people sitting on couches eating popcorn, but to actually open up the access to the science community to do clinical studies that are meaningful and that can use high quality tested product to arrive at some of these conclusions that they already have anecdotal evidence for. So that's why your platform is so very important, because you're getting people interested in that science of cannabis and getting them to understand the importance of educating the scientific and the medical communities and the consumers so that they can apply pressure to their lawmakers.
Yeah, for sure. And, the thing is, I kind of sometimes remind people that it really shouldn't be so surprising that the National Institute of Drug Abuse is not really trying their best to, open up like what they're doing with cannabis, because obviously, that's not their primary role to provide, cannabis for medical research. But at the end of the day, they are. The problem with that whole conversation is that I kind of always jokingly use this reference how, the cannabis has just changed so much over the years, and people, will say, oh, this isn't your parents' weed or your parents' cannabis. I kind of jokingly say to that, well, what is being grown right now with the archaic standards is your parents' cannabis from the government. So I really would love to see them open that up, the licenses to actually grow for research up to some more entities. But really, it's more to do with the standards that they're having to grow the cannabis with, or what they're using is just not great. And Sue's a great dear friend of mine as well. And I remember the first time she was showing me the photos. Our government makes such a big fuss about all this, and it's federally illegal. But, when she received her first package from the government, it was sent in, I believe, a FedEx or a UPS truck. And the guy that brought the shipment to her didn't even know what he was delivering. And, they're all, out there with cameras and video people and stuff. And the guy's like, what am I delivering? And she's like, oh, it's a bunch of cannabis from the government.
That's
but I thought
hilarious.
It was interesting. It just came on like a FedEx or a UPS. I can't remember. It was one of the two. But I just thought that was really interesting. But yeah, Sue is great. She's actually spoke for us last year as a keynote, and she's coming back again this year. We also just announced today that we're going to have Dr. Ethan Russo give a keynote. Tracy's going to give a keynote. She's got a great story. Dr. Bonnie Goldstein from Canna Centers in California, she's going to give a keynote. Obviously, Uma is going to be back. Uma gives a great talk, and then we have a panel that is going to follow her talk that me and her developed last year at our show called The Doc and the Jocks. So she kind of is the moderator and the doctor. And then we have a panel of ex-NFL and different sports leagues players. So last year we had her, and it was Jim McMahon and Marvin Washington. And this year we're going to have Marvin, and we're talking with like Riley Cote and Evan Brighton, and probably Jim again. So that's really fun. A lot of people really loved and, enjoyed attending that. But yeah, I mean, we have so many great speakers, and that's one of the things that I'm just so proud and excited about, is that we've been able to work with such great people from all over the world over the past few years. So this year we're adding a third track. So for 2017, we had our science track, which covered like testing, extraction, sample prep, things like that. And then medical, which obviously covered things like, drug development, international medical updates, like what's going on with cannabis all around the world, palliative patients, pediatric patients, case studies, clinical trials, things like that. And then we're really excited this year, we're launching a third track called the Cultivation Science track. And I have 3 great friends that are working with us to curate the content for that track. Dr. Jacqueline Green and Dr. Roger Kern is a husband and wife team. And they've been full-time consultants in the cannabis industry for a little over a year, maybe a couple years for Roger at this point. But they're actually formerly from NASA's JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And they've done a ton of research there on growing agriculture in space. So it's really great to have, people like that working with us to help us curate the content for that cultivation track. Because again, that's going to be very, very scientific, and not just, I'm the best grower or who's the best grower. It's the science of growing.
Well, what's wonderful about having someone who comes from a non-cannabis background, who's got such high qualifications, it adds so much credibility to the topic. And
absolutely.
I think that is one of the most important aspects of having public figures out there, people that are recognizable to just about everyone in the public eye, talking about cannabis and normalizing the topic of it. And I've interviewed Uma and a number of the athletes that, rotate onto her panel.
Sure.
And it's absolutely incredible the amount of support that we're getting from the athletic level. But when it comes to the athletic franchises, they're fighting it tooth and nail. And I haven't quite figured out why. It's something as a journalist that's piqued my curiosity.
Yeah.
But I'm unable to get any responses from like the NFL. Why? Why are you not pushing this as an alternative? Why are you fighting it? And
absolutely. And we're just pumping them full of, opiates or other medications to get them back on the field. And when you look at these players, like when they're in these leagues, they're lifted up like gods, like celebrities. But really, by the league and by their teams, they're treated like workhorses. Like they work them until they can't anymore. You know what I mean? And then their career's over in the sense of professional. And it's just terrible, because when you see these hits that these guys are taking over and over and over again, and for us as a society to not know a lot about these CTEs and like what is behind all this, I think that these leagues owe it to these individuals that if they want to try something else, let them try it. You know what I mean? Like
yes, absolutely. And it doesn't affect their performance in any way. It's not like the typical doping that you hear about that actually gives an unfair advantage to players who aren't taking steroids, for example. It doesn't have any impact like that whatsoever. And it actually will protect their brains so that when they do sustain these hits, they're not going to be so debilitated 10 years later with premature dementia and depression and all of the things that come along with a traumatic brain injury. So you're absolutely right about that. So yeah, it's very, very important to keep this conversation going. And actually, I invite people to come onto our archives at thecannabisreporter.com and look through some of the speakers that will be at conference, because we've got Dr. Uma, of course, and also Dr. Cicely. We've had her on the show. We've had a number of the individuals that you've mentioned. So they can just peruse through your website, see who the speakers are, and go on to ours and maybe listen in advance to become even more interested in what they're going to have to say at the conference, because obviously they're not going to be talking about the same things with me that they will be at the scientific conference. But it might give a really good idea of what they can expect from some of these really high profile people, athletes and doctors who are out there fighting for this cause. I'm so excited about the future too, and I'm sure that by now you've heard that the Senate has overwhelmingly approved the next steps for a hemp bill. And I'm delighted about that. It's not marijuana, but it's hemp, and it's the step in the right direction. At least now they're finally acknowledging that putting hemp on Schedule 1 was a complete mistake. As many of my guests on this show who are former prosecutors and former law enforcement officers all say, it's such a miscarriage of justice to have anyone serving time in prison for a plant that has never killed anyone, like you said. It's just, it's pretty amazing to me. So
truth is, there are still people sitting in prison. And, a lot of people don't think about that because they think, oh, it's legal here, it's legal in over half the country. But there are a lot of people. And, the sad thing is, to go in a different direction is obviously, the war on drugs has, negatively affected, people of color and communities of color more than anything. And, for like, I'm in Baltimore, for instance, I've known some people and been connected with people, when states have 3 strike loser laws, you could be arrested 3 times with a little bit of cannabis each time, but that 3rd time you're that 3 strike loser law, you're getting some severe sentence. And it's like you just said, it's not right for people to be sitting in prisons and, building on this corporate prison system that we have here. Meanwhile, there's so much other things going on. I don't think that the people that are using cannabis should be, enemy number one to the state or the government. I like what I see California doing. They're doing a lot of social equity. They're trying to, get people released that, have nonviolent cannabis charges or even drug charges. So I just think that, like we talked on earlier, the reefer madness and the propaganda, like all of that worked for, over 80 years. So now we're really trying to change perceptions. And, the thing that I find unfortunate is the baby boomer generation and older still have these ideas in their mind because that's what they were raised with.
That's exactly right. And unfortunately, that is the generation that could actually use cannabis the most, because what they're finding with some of these age-related diseases is that they are actually either caused or exacerbated by a deficiency of the endocannabinoid system. Yes. So, and a lot of people don't understand this, but it's a tough nut to crack. I mean, when you've perceived a certain truth because of propaganda that's been drilled into your head for 60 years of your life, to all of a sudden try to undo that knowledge that you believe is truth is a very difficult thing, and I think that goes to a lot of the problems that we have in our society with this division that's happening right now, because you have extreme views on all sides trying to fight with untruths that have been expressed over and over and over again. And they say, if you tell a lie often enough, it becomes someone's truth. Because they
Absolutely.
hear it, it's marketing 101, advertising 101. You say it over and over and over again, and eventually somebody believes it. Well, that's what happened with reefer madness, and but that's why we have to make so much noise, because
Sure.
We have to start contradicting those falsehoods out in the public so that people really get a clear understanding that they've been fed a bill of goods, and that once they begin to understand the truth, it could benefit their own lives in tremendous ways. And California, good on them for actually trying to address some of the social justice issues. I heard today that a sentence was commuted by the president, a woman she's already served 21 years for a first-time offense. And when I hear things like that, it just breaks my heart that 21 years of her life are just down the toilet. But
oh, sure.
Thank God someone's addressing it. And I know that before President Obama left office, he commuted, I think there were like 500 or 600 nonviolent drug offenses that, just to make sure that these people weren't rotting in jail for their life, because they were often third-time offenders. and that 3 strikes you're out, lifetime sentence that's going to put money in the pockets of the private prisons and really have no benefit on society. And if anything, it's deleterious effects on the society because you've already disrupted families of all of these 2.2 so million people who've been in jail for marijuana offenses. So you multiply that by how many people are in the family impacted, and they're losing their breadwinners. When they get out of jail, they can't get a job, they can't vote. They're basically marginalized from society. So yeah, I mean, this is such an insidious problem, and I'm glad that you're raising that issue too. And I hope that people really start to understand the importance of calling their representatives and saying, hey, listen, help us make some noise.
And voting.
Voting. Vote your conscience.
The thing that I love about cannabis, and this is just even crazier with, its federal status, is, there was a recent Quinnipiac poll that showed that 96% of Democrats supported legal medical cannabis. And I think it was 92 or 93% of Republicans. And I think that really shows that whether you sit on the left, the side, the middle, or you don't sit at all, this is a bipartisan issue, and it's got bipartisan support across the board. And I think that there's a lot to this that we don't even know. I mean, you look at the fact that our government says that there is no health benefits to cannabis being a Schedule 1 drug, yet they have a patent on it for neuroprotectant and antioxidant.
Yeah, and they grant licenses to pharmaceutical companies to possess and distribute these scheduled substances.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if you saw this or not, but there was a company called Insys who had a drug called Subsys, and this was a aerosol fentanyl spray that was supposed to only be prescribed to high barrier cancer pain patients that could not swallow. So this drug company was sending the drug reps, going to the visits. There was even situations where I think there was drug reps in the doctor's visit with the patient and the doctor pushing this drug on them. And they got busted, and they were going through all these things. And then in the middle of an investigation against them for all this, the government gave them the right to develop synthetic cannabinoids.
Yeah, and in fact, of the 6 companies that I mentioned that were granted license to import thousands of pounds of scheduled substances, Insys was one of them.
Yeah.
When you consider that the drugs that they have developed have killed thousands of people just this year, and
the ways that they went about their marketing, and traveling international can open your eyes up to the way the rest of the world is, and you live in this little bubble here in the U.S. But it's interesting, and a lot of people don't realize in other countries, pharmaceutical companies are not permitted to advertise their products or their pills to the general public. And there are strict guidelines on how they even advertise their products to doctors and healthcare professionals. So, as you know, every other commercial on TV is, oh, do you feel this way? Do you feel that way? Take this drug. And everything's a one-size-fits-all pill for everyone. And, we're all different. Just because 2 people are the same age, the same sex, and they have the same condition, they're very different. Their DNA is different. They're going to respond to drugs differently. So, one of the things that I have a lot of faith in cannabis is precision medicine. So like I said, developing these protocols individually for your condition and your genetics and your makeup, so you can really target treat conditions. As cannabis is something that is both a great medicine, I also feel, personally that it is preventative for a lot of things. I was really excited to see that Pennsylvania added addiction to their program just recently.
Addiction and PTSD.
Yes. So, and then, with every one of these wins, you see another fallback. Like I know just in Colorado, there was an issue where I think they didn't move forward with something for autism there. So it's like you said, like contacting your representative, because it really does make a difference. If we all kind of get together and band together to do these things, we make our voices louder. And that's why I think like attending things like the NCAA, they do lobby days. I think getting involved with those kind of things is really, really important. And going back to what you said a little while ago, like with the sports players, the celebrities, last year we had Montel Williams, that was our plenary speaker, and it was great having him. A lot of celebrities are starting to get involved now. Montel was kind of one of the really early on supporters of this industry. This year we're in final stages of getting everything signed and locked in with our plenary speaker for this year. So I cannot, as much as I'd like to say a name yet, but I can say that she is a very, very well-known television and film that is very widely recognized and has recently started to get more involved with the industry and want to see more education and starting to put her name behind it. So that's something I'm also really excited about on the second hand with that is also bringing in new support of new people that are celebrities that have influence and they have audiences and they have followings. I just think we're all our own voice and we're all one voice. But when we put our voices together, we're united and we're louder and we're stronger. And, it's like that saying, stronger together. I think that we as a community need to remember that. And, sometimes you feel a little discouraged with the industry because you see things that go like business, and you think sometimes community gets kind of sideswiped and doesn't get as much attention as it should. I also really hope that we maintain, these medical programs all across the country. Because, I've seen some, alarming things in certain states where, they have a medical program and then they bring on their adult use program. And then eventually the medical program really dwindles or kind of gets incorporated into the recreational program or kind of really just dissolves. I listened to a bit of you and Tracy's interview, and you guys talked a little bit about some of the challenges that her brand and like other, medical brands in California are facing post, adult use legalization. So I think that, we still have a long way to go. And it's really interesting to me that we kind of started this movement in 96, right? In California, really the HIV/AIDS, I think, movement really pushed that through in California, with Dennis Perone, he passed some months back. But, he really was the big advocate that got this going in California. And then all these other countries now are starting to like follow suit from us, but they're all doing it on a countrywide level. So it's like we started the movement, but we're still on the state by state level. But it really, it's amazing. It feels like it's taking forever sometimes. But when you just stop and look back, over the past 3, 4, 5 years, we've gotten over half the country. So I think, in that sense, we're doing pretty good.
Well, absolutely we are. Unfortunately, we are not a nation that is truly democratic in the sense that the people have the power when they vote, because we still have Citizens United to deal with, and we've got a lot of corporate dollars that are influencing policy right now. And that really is one of the most unfortunate hindrances, I think, because the pharmaceutical companies do have a free license to create whatever they want. And just because they've created something else that was successful in the past, and they do a couple of clinical trials on medicine that they will promote as one size fits all, like you said, that's not good enough. And the drugs that we're given that are synthetic are not assimilated in our bodies without doing damage to certain other aspects of our bodies. The biggest example, the most obvious, of course, is chemotherapy. You kill the cancer, but you kill a lot of other things with it. With cannabis, we have that endogenous system that thrives on cannabinoids, and it makes every other system in our body more healthy as opposed to making us less healthy because we're taking a certain drug. And I think that it is almost criminal that we do allow the advertising here in the United States, because I think that clouds a lot of perceptions. You see these joyous, happy people, taking these what can be lethal drugs. And then you hear the long list of side effects. And the other thing about that just makes me crazy is the fact that we pay more than anyone else in the world for our pharmaceuticals. And when you look at the cost of advertising and you see how often pharmaceutical companies are advertising things that patients can't even just go to the store and buy, they have to go to the doctor and get. You just see that there's this real waste of money. We are paying in our drug prices, we are paying for all of those commercials, and no other industry has that kind of money to advertise. No other industry has that kind of money to advertise. So, we've got some issues.
Well, I was just on a flight, and there were at least 2 pharma, products in Time magazine I was looking at as I was flying in that had 2-page spreads each. Like, I can only imagine what a 2-page spread in Time magazine costs, let alone these national television campaigns, that you see all over the place. So you're exactly right. With any product, the price is kind of set to offset the overhead. So if that's what they consider their overhead to do all these marketing, consumers are paying for that. And I think that you see a lot of countries that provide healthcare for individuals. Obviously, we don't do that here in the U.S. But I think that we could do a lot better with our healthcare here. And I think, like you said, the premiums that people are paying and the prices for drugs, and these drugs are to the point to where if you don't have health insurance, you just can't afford to take the drug that you need that that's going to help you or save you or whatever the case may be. And basically here in the U.S., all we have is you're required to see someone in the ER visit, and then that's it. That's that's all you're really.
Well, that's another advantage to regulating cannabis, because once it's legal and people understand what it can and can't do, it's good for preventative medicine, but it's also got curative properties. And even though we don't have the scientific research yet here in the United States that's acceptable by the government, we do have a lot of anecdotal evidence, and there are a lot of very highly qualified people who are researching the precision aspects of the medicine of cannabis. And so, there are resources that cost a fraction of what the pharmaceutical industry is charging. And, if people do find out that they've got a debilitating condition, there are medical professionals who are educated about the endocannabinoid system who can help them understand. And it just takes a little bit more research. It's not like you can just call up your primary care provider and show up at his office and say, okay, talk about cannabis, because chances are
they don't know anything.
You have schizophrenia if you take it, or they just don't know anything about it. And, that's going to change too with regulation. Another reason to pick up the phone and call your representatives.
It's so funny because I work with, some of the pediatric people that we know and we work with, for Tracy, for instance, is very educated, obviously, about cannabis. So, I've seen situations where, families are going to doctors and these cancer clinics, and they're like, hey, can you tell us about this? Like, is this an option? And the doctor doesn't really know, but they end up kind of connecting patients with other patients that know more about it to get the education. And that, like we said earlier, the physician education is a problem. I see even in some of the states that are doing medical programs, I see a lot of doctors that are signing up to recommend, but what education are those doctors receiving? Like, how are they being trained to then turn around and give information to the patients that they're recommending to?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And we don't know.
Right.
But there is so much information available online. There are thousands of clinical studies that have been done in Europe and in Asia and other parts of the world that are available on pubmeds.gov. So, if people are really curious, they can actually do their own homework. And something else that we have is the ability to sort of participate in our care with cannabis, because we are left to our own devices a lot. But, once we find professionals who do know what they're talking about and who understand these studies and all of that, we can take the lead in understanding even more, because it's less opaque than pharmaceutical medicine. You go on and try to find information about any one of INSYS's drugs, fentanyl, for example, and you'll see readily available the list of side effects, but they make it so difficult for consumers to understand the science behind the medicine. They make it readable only for trained medical professionals, which is fine, but still people can't participate in their own care unless they go through this enormous learning curve to understand the chemistry of what's happening. So, and because cannabis has been illegal for so long, the grassroots movement has actually made it a lot more transparent in terms of patient participation. So,
and what you just said is absolutely true. As I mentioned, I'm here in Canada. I'm going to be giving a couple talks at this conference, but the one I'm giving tomorrow, I have an example of the amount of PubMed hits for marijuana or cannabis compared to the top 10 selling drugs. So, and it's, cannabis is over 26,000, but some of these top selling drugs like Crestor, Abilify, Humira, like these are nowhere near. Crestor, there's about 2161. when we're talking 2,161. So with marijuana or cannabis, there's almost 27,000. And this data was probably from, going back 3 or 4 months ago. So there is information out there. The way that they kind of try to tie our hands and validate our information is that it's not clinical trials. The thing is, how can we do clinical trials and get the results that we need to when, as we talked about earlier, you have people like Sue Sisley and trying to do the great work that she's trying to do and is doing, goes through all these hoops and whistles, and then you finally get a package from the government, and it's nothing like what you're actually trying to study the effects of.
Yeah, we have so much to learn still. So many of the studies that you mentioned are actually not performed on humans, but just having the indications through the either animal testing or just the chemistry in the lab that is showing promise. It's really giving clinicians who will be conducting studies once it's legal for them to do so, it's going to be giving them tools that pharmaceutical researchers don't have at their disposal.
Sure.
So, there are a lot of advantages to advancing the science of cannabis.
Well, you see doctors like Dr. Uma. I have a dear friend out of Maryland. She works with the Forward Grow in Maryland, Dr. Deb Kimless. You're seeing that these doctors, these nurses, these medical professionals that are involved with the industry are just getting fed up, and they're just starting to do these awesome case studies with their patients. You know what I mean? So I think that, enough can't be said about that as well. So yeah, that might not be a clinical trial, but, these doctors are taking the time and saying, like, look, we need to start monitoring this and tracking these patients and, seeing what's working for them and tracking their success and tracking their, their issues with it. Because, at the end of the day, I also don't prescribe to the belief that, cannabis is all cupcakes and rainbows. I think that there are some drugs that can interact with cannabis pharmaceutical wise. I think obviously we talked about the contamination issue. I think getting the right cannabinoid profile for you and your experience is a journey. For instance, some cannabis can exacerbate certain conditions. So if you have PTSD or anxiety, certain strains or profiles of cannabis can actually kind of pep up your anxiety and PTSD and things like that. So I think getting this research done and trying to pinpoint like exactly what it is and why it is that either really helps with things or might, not be the right strain. You have to find a different one. So I think we're finding out more and more of these answers every day. And just looking back at like the 3.5 years that I've been in the industry, we've come, so far. And, obviously we have so far to go, but I just look back and when I first came in, I'm like, oh, lab testing, this and that. People are like, I don't want to talk about that. Like, it's just more money. It's just more things for us to pay for. But now I think people are really starting to get it and understand that quality control is ensuring that your patients or your customers are getting quality, clean medicine that you can stand by as a brand and know that you're doing the right thing. And, on the flip side of that, I think it's also a marketing, standpoint. If you're, doing the testing, you're doing as much testing as possible. If there's issues, you're pulling it. Obviously we saw in California last year, there was a huge mycobutanol spike in a lot of brands, and there was a whole issue with, regulating that. But I'm very happy to see where it's going. And, for me, bringing new and exciting individuals into this industry is really what my passion is. That's exactly what my definition of bridging the gap is really is, bringing the genius science-based people or the genius medical people into the cannabis space. So, and a lot of these people are people that have been, afraid or not really interested in getting involved. They didn't really understand it. But obviously, as we go along, this is just getting more and more credibility. And as an industry, we need to take the support from everybody that gives it. Obviously, recently we saw John Boehner came out and has changed his mind about cannabis and has been saying, that he believes in it and he's working with a company. And, there was some backlash on that. And I'm like, just because you might not agree with someone politically or personally doesn't mean that we don't need their support as an industry. They're on our side now. So really at the end of the day, we want more people on our side than not on our side. And that's how I look at that.
Yeah, it's only going to get better. And I agree. When John Boehner came out, I was thrilled that he's supporting it because he represents the groups that really was opposed to it for so long. And whether it was just a lack of knowledge or political reasons or whatever, at this point is irrelevant. The fact that he's actually advocating now, I think is really helping the political credibility in Congress. People will listen if one of their former peers actually speaks out on behalf of this science.
It's almost more powerful for our side when we have people that have been so adamantly against it and so kind of on the complete opposite side of the spectrum that then come around. Because I think those, obviously when the more liberal politicians, I can't remember the lady's name, but it was a Democratic senator, and it was like a headline, like she changed her mind about cannabis. And I'm like, shocking. You know what I mean? Like, it's like when you get these hardcore Republicans, sometimes it's great to see the support come from all sides of the spectrum. You know what I mean? And I think we really have seen that over the past handful of years. Presidential candidates like Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, who have been, super open to really pushing this and getting the message out there.
Once the genie has been let out of the bottle, you can't really put it back in. And we have a situation now where people who are still fighting the reform of the law around cannabis, are going to find themselves erring on the wrong side of history, because people are going to remember that they prevented their child from taking a medicine that could help them with epilepsy. And people will remember those who made it easier for a sick person to get access to a medicine that could save their life. Or their football hero who was suffering with CTE can find comfort with cannabis, because those voices are being heard, and the politicians who are fighting this still will find themselves losing their jobs. And Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Independent, Green, whatever, if they're not embracing truth about the science of cannabis, they will ultimately be erring on the wrong side of history. So
I 100% agree with that, for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you for what you are doing to educate people. I think it's just incredibly important. And I wish you all success with this upcoming event, and we'll continue to put more and more information about it as you release information about your speakers. I'm very eager to hear who your secret speaker is.
Yes, I'll keep you posted on that.
And with that, it is time to bring yet another show to a close. Once again, I would like to personally thank my guest, Josh Crossney, for sharing his insights and knowledge with us today. If you'd like to learn more about JCanna or the Cannabis Science Conference or other work he's doing, please visit us online at thecannabisreporter.com. Click podcast to find today's episode. I'll post his bio along with information and a link to his website. We have so many others to thank. First, I'd like to express our gratitude for our radio sponsors, Alpine Miracle, Healthterra, and Compassionate Certification Centers. We certainly couldn't be doing this without you. I'd also like to thank Dr. Brian Donner for our Medical Marijuana Minute, Eric Goodall for our theme song, Evergreen, and our producers and publishing team at the Cannabis Reporter for making us shine. I'd also like to give a shout out to our program directors at XRQK Radio Network, Society Bites Radio, and of course, our friends over at Cannabis Radio for helping us to distribute our show. And last but not least, thanks to all of you for listening around the nation. I'm your host, Snowden Bishop, inviting you to join me again next week, same time, same place, for another episode of the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show. Until we meet again, be safe, stay informed, share what you've learned, call your representatives, and make it a great day.
Evergreen is calling.